Topic 1, Introduction to Globalization. So we'll be starting with the definition of globalization as well as its concepts, features, and dimensions. First up, we have here the following. Globalization is said to be a process in which people, ideas, and goods spread throughout the world, spurring more interaction and integration between the world's cultures, governments, and economies. Apart from that, it is also said to be a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies, and governments of different nations. So, na-mention dito yung pag-spread ng ideas as well as goods and people around the globe. It is made possible through technology as well as the innovations na nangyari in communication and transportation. Together with that commodities, nagkakaroon din tayo ng relation or ng interaction with other people from different nation. With that being said, hindi lang yung commodity ang nakakarating sa kanila, kundi pati na din yung culture or tradition na meron yung bansa na pinanggalingan. Then we have here a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies, and governments of different nations. Kasi as we know, when we say globalization, they are extending their connection from their country to another country. That's why hindi natin maiaalis na magkakaroon ng interaction and integration between the governments involved. Next is that it is a process driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. Whenever we encounter globalization, it is said to be na isa sa main drivers nito ay ang information technology. Kasi this information technology carry on information from one point to another in a faster and more efficient way. So economic life is dramatically transformed by this advancement. The economic actors, just like consumers, investors, and businesses, they play a valuable tool when it comes to identifying and pursuing economic opportunities, which can make it faster and more informed when it comes to economic trends around the globe. And through information technology, nagkakaroon ng easier transfer of assets and then collaboration na din between the economic actors. Kasi possible na through different platforms na makipag-communicate tayo kahit pa nasa ang parte ng mundo as long as merong internet connection. Globalization is about growing worldwide connectivity. Whenever we are talking about globalization, it is the expansion of goals between the nations wherein they share a common goal. Apart from that, it is said to be an international, industrial, and financial business structure. This globalization is technically focused in the economy of a certain country kasi it will have a domino effect to other dimensions of globalization, which will later be discussed as we progress on discussing this topic. So with that, we will arrive at this conclusion wherein it says that globalization is an expansion and intensification of social relations and consciousness across world time and world space. Once again, this is made possible by information technology. It is about growing worldwide connectivity according to stature. And then it involves the multiplication of social connections and various activities that transgress traditional and political, economic, cultural, and geographical lines.
Globalization is a widely discussed topic. It is therefore not all that easy to explain such a complicated term in simple words. Let's start from the beginning with the background to globalization. Advances in technology, such as mobile phones, aeroplanes, telephones, and the internet, have made the growth of transport and communication networks possible. Amongst other things, this means that people and countries can exchange information and goods more quickly and in a less complicated way. This process is called globalization. Globalization comes from globe
Hello.
and means the worldwide coming together of countries and nations. Let's look at an example. Companies used to manufacture products in their home countries, just like the companies Profi TV and Supercolor, who produce televisions in country A. Their products are in direct competition with each other, but both companies pay the same salaries and production costs. They have the same customers, use similar suppliers, and sell televisions at similar prices. In short, the same conditions apply to both companies. So far, so good. Due to technical, cultural, and economic developments that have come about through globalization, other companies which manufacture products under different conditions can now offer their products in country A too. That's why a company from country B can sell televisions here at a lower price because they were produced for less. The local firms Supercolor and Profi TV have to react to withstand the competition. And so the world grows closer together, and there is an active exchange of goods between countries. More affordable products are available for more people. However, not only does an exchange of products and economic goods take place, but also of services, knowledge, cultural goods, and even languages. All of these individual elements are closely linked and influence each other. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Because of globalization and this intense exchange of goods, people and the environment often suffer. If a company decides to move production to an economically disadvantaged country, people in industrialized countries lose their jobs. At the same time, job opportunities open up to many locals in the economically disadvantaged country. Many people in these countries work for very little money in comparison to those in industrialized countries. Therefore, they often remain poor and more often than not do not have sufficient insurance, social insurance, or health insurance cover. A further disadvantage of globalization is ecological problems such as climate change. The use of aeroplanes, ships, and lorries to transport goods over international borders is constantly on the increase. This causes more carbon dioxide to be released into the atmosphere, which, in turn, is the main cause of global warming. Even national environmental standards are ignored. This is a further cost factor in the worldwide international site competition, which should be kept as low as possible to be attractive for a company. There are therefore many sides to globalization, which affect almost all aspects of life, causing me to think that the chain of positive and negative effects will continue to grow further. What's important is to realize that globalization itself is neither good nor bad. It just depends how people deal with all the new possibilities in the future.
Talking about the attributes or characteristics of globalization, una, it involves both the creation of new social networks and the multiplication of existing connections that cut across traditional political, economic, cultural, and geographical boundaries. So, kung dati, local news lang yung nababasa natin or nalalaman natin kasi wala tayong access to information, wala tayong access to internet, dahil sa existence ng technology, which is brought by globalization, we can now have the news or we can now determine what is happening across the globe. Kung sila ba ay merong improvement when it comes to their way of living, kung merong bagong culture na ipopro na nagiging rampant or nagiging naipa-practice sa isang country as well as sa political status ng isang bansa. So, through technology, nagagawa nating malaman yung mga bagay na yun. And globalization is also reflected in the expansion of the stretching of social relations, activities, and connections. Dito ngayon papasok yung social stretching which is connected to erasing the boundaries between traditional, political, economic, cultural, and geographic boundaries. It is reaching of financial markets around the globe. And then, nagkakaroon ng emergence of gigantic and virtually identical shopping malls in all continents to cater to consumers who can afford commodities all over the world, including products whose various components were manufactured in different countries, just like using the platforms of Shopee, Lazada, Zalora. Apart from those platforms, when it comes to social stretching, it also involves non-governmental organization, social clubs, and even regional and global institutions or associations. Number three, globalization involves intensification and acceleration of social exchanges and activities. Right now that we are experiencing the pandemic, so through globalization, it became a tool para hindi malimit kung ano yung nangyayari, kung ano yung social exchanges and activities na nagagawa natin. Yung mga information ay po pwede nang ma-transfer real time. Just like what we are having right now. So instead of face-to-face classes, we are having online synchronous classes. At kung ano man yung nasasabi ko ngayon, nare-receive niyo siya in real time. Once again, nagkakaroon dito ng involvement si globalization. Next, nagkakaroon ng sophistication when it comes to social networking by means of Facebook or Twitter. Yun yung naging routine for more than a billion of people around the globe. So the intensification of worldwide social relations means that local happenings are shaped by events occurring far away and vice versa. Just like what I mentioned a while ago, nagkakaroon na tayo ng access to different news across the globe. Nakakatulong itong mga news na to for us to have an edge with regards to different situations. Yung mga information na yun nagagamit natin, halimbawa kung ano yung trends sa ibang bansa, nalalaman natin. Kung ano yung mga dapat nating paghandaan na calamities, kung ano yung mga kinakailangan nating paghandaan na hazard, nagagawan natin ng paraan. Kasi we do have access to information. Yun din ang isa sa examples na pwede natin i-take when it comes to social activities or social exchanges. Kasi we're not just talking about the positive social exchanges or activities. We are also talking about the not so good social exchanges. So, nagkakaroon ngayon ng nagkakaroon ngayon ng interaction of local and global relations. Nagkakaroon ng overlapping with regards to national and regional horizontal scale. Number 4, globalization processes do not occur merely or an objective, material level, but they also involve the subjective plane of human consciousness. Without erasing local and national attachments, the compression of the world into a single place has increasingly made global the frame of reference for human thought and action. Globalization, in that sense, involves both the macro structures and global community and the microstructures of global personhood. It extends deep into the core of the self and its dispositions. It facilitates the creation of multiple individual and collective identities nurtured by the intensifying relations between the personal and the global. They just differ with each other by means of acceleration in the speed of social exchanges and widening of geographical scopes. History of globalization, or the historical period of globalization, wherein we have the following: the prehistoric, pre-modern, early modern, modern, and contemporary period. Dito sa prehistoric period, andyan pa lang yung mga hunters and gatherers. They spread around the globe, pero meron pang geographical limitation. Dito na yung invention of writing and the wheel. Nagkaroon tayo ngayon ng level up when it comes to globalization. Kasi it contributes to the social and technological boost of globalization. It adds up to the creation of roads, which made transportation easier and more efficient. Then, yung handwriting naman, it facilitated the spread of ideas. Tapos, in the early modern period, which is the period between the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, nagkaroon tayo ng European Enlightenment project, which tried to achieve a universal form of morality and law. The emergence of European metropolitan centers and unlimited material accumulation led to the capitalist world system, wherein it helps to strengthen globalization. When we say capitalist world system, ito yung mga sinasabi natin, may mga kapitalista at merong mga consumers. At dito na din nagre-revolve yung concept na kung sino yung mayayaman, mas yumayaman. At kung sino yung mahihirap, mas humihirap. Pero, merong claim ang globalization wherein hindi lang naman mayayaman ang nakikinabang dito, kundi pati na din mahirap in the long run. Next, we have here the modern period. Innovations in transportation and communication technology, population explosion, and increase in migration led to more cultural exchanges and transformation in traditional and social patterns. Kasi nga, meron na tayong greater access when it comes to technology. That's why, mas napapabilis na din yung ating pag-transfer ng information and commodities, as well as communication and transportation. Dito na din nagkaroon ng acceleration when it comes to industrialization. And as you know, when we talk about industrialization, it is something to do with machineries and mass productions. Then, sa contemporary period naman, nandito yung creation, expansion, and acceleration of worldwide interdependencies, which occurred in a dramatic way, and it was a kind of leap in the history of globalization. Kasi we now have access to technology, we now have the machinery, we are leading to industrialization.
A History of Globalization by Amanda Johnson. Our world. Population upwards of 7 billion and ever increasing. As population grows and time goes on, human civilization becomes even more interconnected through a process called globalization. Globalization is defined as the intensification and acceleration of social exchange, social consciousness, and social activities that allows all types of people to interact. It is the dynamic shift towards a unified world where borders, language, ethnicity, government, etc. do not limit communication. Thanks to the growth of technology, it is now easier than ever for the 7 billion people on this planet to interact and grow as a society. However, globalization is not a new phenomenon. In this video, we will explore its historical roots. Globalization began in the Prehistoric Period, defined as 10,000 BCE to 3500 BCE. During this time, prehistoric man spread across the globe in small groups of hunter-gatherers. As seen in the animals depicted here on the walls of the Lascaux caves in France, prehistoric hunter-gatherer groups were preoccupied with hunting. These groups were focused on survival, and it was not until the domestication of animals and the growth of settled farming that the possibility for globalization as we define it existed. As agrarian societies developed and the need for food was no longer the primary motive, society began to differentiate a hierarchy and allow for the growth of different social classes. The patriarchal society of settled groups, which still exists today, developed during this time. However, there was limited communication between small settled societies. The communication was limited by the little technology available, and for these reasons, this period did not see much in the way of globalization. However, it was a time of great spread for humanity. However, moving into the pre-modern period, 3500 BCE to 1500 CE, larger civilizations developed which gave way to the current definition of globalization. Large cities with different classes of people began to crop up again across the ancient Near East and Asia. The invention of writing, cuneiform by the Mesopotamians as seen on this tablet, was a major leap in communication technology. Writing allowed for the recording of details such as financial accounts, which made it possible for large amounts of information to be remembered and transmitted. The eventual discovery of the Rosetta Stone, with the same passage translated into 3 ancient languages, shows that pre-modern societies communicated in various written forms. The advent of the wheel was likewise crucial for globalization. It allowed goods to be transported across long distances in carts, and architectural technology to improve. This led to the establishment of roads, which led to increased trade and communication between growing world empires. The pre-modern period was really a time for the development of large civilizations. The Egyptian Empire flourished during this time, with great advances in engineering, technology, and art. Chinese empires, with their advances in mathematics, sciences, and warfare, also developed alongside, and may have communicated with other world empires. Greek civilization cropped up during this time as well, creating a system of democracy that is the basis for many modern governments. The Greeks controlled a vast territory and flourished as a center for the arts and philosophy for many years. From 500 BCE to 500 CE, the Roman Empire was the dominant force in the Western world. Their empire was vast and went through periods of democracy and periods of absolute rulers. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled much of Western Europe. It expanded all the way into the United Kingdom, spreading Latin across the continent. Roman Latin is the origin of the Romance languages spoken throughout the world today. The Romans are also responsible for many permanent roads and buildings which still exist today. The first trade routes between Roman-controlled areas cropped up during this time. Eventually, the Roman Empire became Christianized and disintegrated into the Holy Roman Empire, which could almost be considered a proto-intergovernmental organization of the past. Independent states, of course, existed within the empire, but were controlled by the religious body of the time, the Pope. But what does the Age of Empires mean for globalization? Not only was there communication between different groups of people within the empires, there was communication between the empires themselves. It was a time for the foundation of the first global trade routes, utilizing developing transportation technology like more permanent roads, better ships, and animal-drawn carts and wagons. It was during this time that the origins of the Silk Road cropped up as trade routes, which will be focused on later. Goods traveled between empires, but so did religion, technology, and disease. The Age of Empires was a time for great technological advance, but after the Roman Empire fell, the growth of technology stalled in the Western world. For several hundred years, called the Middle Ages, very little changed in Western Europe specifically. Trade stalled as people struggled to survive in a colder climate. A system of feudalism developed, which kept lower-class people down, and the upper class were able to control all the imported resources and the trade system. Eventually, the demand for foreign resources, especially spices and silk from the East, grew so high that the wealthy paid for merchants to transport goods, particularly along the Silk Road from China to Western Europe. The merchant class began to grow as population began to decline. Merchant ships became a great way to trade, as they were faster than walking, but they also brought disease. The Black Death came into Europe and other parts of the world during the Middle Ages, the 14th century, and wiped out almost one-third of the global population. This was a time where globalization may have had a negative effect on the world. Because goods and people were traveling all around, disease too was traveling with them. The ending of the Black Death marked the ending of the pre-modern period and the transition to the early modern period during the 1500s. As the Black Death faded, population began to increase and urbanize once again. Improved transportation technology allowed for the immigration of people to different parts of the world. The exchange of ideas in urban centers and the rediscovery of ideas from ancient societies brought about the Renaissance, a rebirth of art and learning in the Western world. There was now a drive to explore the rest of the world. Rulers wanted to claim new territory to acquire money, ideas, goods to trade, and religious converts. It was the goal of many to find faster routes to India, and this is why Columbus, sent by the Spanish, claimed America, originally mistaking it for India. Development during the early modern period from 1500 to 1750 was aided by the invention of the printing press and the improvement of navigation and sailing technologies. The Western world expanded, and the contact with Native American societies fits into the process of globalization, even though the effects were largely negative for the existing populations of new people in new lands. The great Central American empires were wiped out by conquistadors through bloody battles and disease, all for their resources. This period was detrimental to certain populations of people, but it opened up new trade routes and increased the desire to expand Western society, to find a new world. People came across on ships to colonize America, destroying Native American civilizations in their wake. According to Globalization, a very short introduction, upwards of 90% of the Native American populations were destroyed by disease during this time. Despite the tragic death of native populations, colonization attempts in the New World began to succeed. There was now an even greater land area on which Western countries could expand and claim resources, as they completely disregarded the claims of Native Americans. Back in Europe, increased population and urbanization led to the growth of the middle class. The merchant class began to create a more modern capitalist economy. The Protestant Reformation brought into question the absolute sovereignty of rulers. The amount of small kingdoms began to decline, eventually culminating in the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, which established the modern nation-state system in place today. In terms of globalization, there were now larger countries with borders that did not necessarily fit the ethnic groups contained within them, leading to tension down the line. During this time as well, the Dutch and British East India Companies began to establish trading posts throughout the world. This eventually led to a system of imperialism as countries wanted to gain more resources, but was also important to the furtherance of globalization as people and new ideas were transported around the world along with goods. The modern period, designated by Globalization a very short introduction as 1750 to 1980, was headed off by a time known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a time where philosophers like John Locke and Voltaire met up and came up with ideas such as natural rights, life, liberty, and property. The belief in these rights are the basis of the American Revolution, beginning in 1776. The American Revolution was the start of many revolutions against monarchies and the formation of new democracies. America was founded on the capitalistic economic system, led and molded by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. This inspired the French, all the way across the ocean, to rebel against their monarchy as well. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of revolution. The democratic systems put in place by new republics still carry on today, and America inspired much of the world. With protections for the freedom of speech and religion among others, democracies furthered the pace of globalization, because in theory, people could travel to democratic lands and be accepted regardless of their ideas. The foundation of America led to an increase in immigration due to the prosperous democratic country. It was also the beginning of industrialization in America and Europe, and there was greater urbanization and more jobs available than ever before. The 1800s saw waves of immigration, especially by Europeans fleeing famine and seeking a better life. America became known as a cultural melting pot, and ideas from all over the world traveled there and grew. This time was known for great leaps in technological invention that made communication easier than ever before. With increased technology came an increased need for territory and resources, leading to the expansion of imperialism. Imperialism may have benefited certain powerful Western countries, but was detrimental to the lands they occupied. However, global trade greatly increased during this time, leading to greater prosperity and urbanization than ever seen before. Borders established during the earlier settlements in the Peace of Westphalia also created tension during this time. World War I began due to the violence in the ethnically diverse Balkan Peninsula. The war was a clash of old and new fighting styles and technology, which led to the death of many. And, for the first time, large coalitions of countries were pitted against each other. Eventually, troubles in Russia led to their own internal revolution, which began during the First World War. This established another new system of government besides democracy, communism. While the West feared the rise of the communist system, it had other problems. The Treaty of Versailles, written at the end of World War I, laid in place tensions which would later lead to another World War. It was during this time as well when Woodrow Wilson proposed the first intergovernmental organization, the League of Nations. While America declined to join, countries in Europe banded together in the League of Nations to try and prevent further tragedies such as World War I. The Great Depression hit America after World War I, causing the decline of the economy. But it also affected the economy of the entire world, showing the interconnections that were beginning to form economically due to globalism. Globalization had allowed world trade and production to become so intertwined with the American economy that when the Great Depression hit in 1929, both of these things fell dramatically. It took years and many new systems for the world to climb out of the Great Depression. World War II involved again large groups of countries working together to defeat a common enemy, the Axis powers. It also gave a way for America to continue its climb as a global superpower, working its way up from the Great Depression. Old world empires were no longer the dominant power in the world, and interaction with other countries outside of what is considered the West began to grow. This period saw a massive increase in global population and a massive increase in transnational communication. Global companies began to crop up during this time. It was after World War II where communism became the main threat. The United States feared the growth of communism because the USSR was becoming another global superpower. The technological development of nuclear weapons mutually assured the destruction of the two countries if they were to ever face off, which caused a Cold War. Eventually, though, American democracy and the capitalist system won over the USSR and the Berlin Wall fell. 1980 was the end of the modern period and saw the shift into the contemporary period which we are currently in. The Berlin Wall fell, heading off the era where capitalism and American governmental and economic systems seemed to become the model for all developing countries to follow. The recent decades have seen the rise of intergovernmental organizations like the European Union and the United Nations. Recently, as well, international trade groups like Asian and the economic systems like the International Monetary Fund have cropped up. This begs the question: is the next step in globalization the elimination of traditional borders in favor of the governance of organizations like these? I feel that the history of globalization shows us how far we have come. We are moving together as a society to solve greater world issues. No longer can world problems be contained merely by borders, as they have grown too large and affect too many people. For example, there is an increased importance placed on education. The history of globalization shows as people become more educated and develop new technology, their overall quality of life improves. For example, Malala Yousafzai has brought to attention the need for women's education as an end to violence in the Middle East and other areas of the world. If people were more educated and aware, perhaps they would be likewise more conscious of their environmental impact. If we do not change, the environment will no longer be able to adequately sustain our growing population. The entirety of human history has been about growth and progress, and I feel as we grow more interconnected through globalization, we need to reflect on how we can progress while improving the lives of everyone on the planet. Globalization is defined as the intensification and acceleration of social exchange, consciousness, and activities, allowing all types of people to interact. Throughout history, people have been growing more and more conscious of social problems. With our history in mind, I predict that the increased power of IGOs rather than the traditional nation-state will lead to a more harmonious world. History shows there will always be conflict, but overall, the lives of people on Earth are improving due to the process of globalization.
Okay, so after knowing the history of globalization, let's now move forward to the dimensions of globalization. We have economic, political, technological, cultural, religious, and ideological. So let's start with economic. Economic dimension. It includes global finance and economy, multinational corporations, networking, international trade and businesses, new labor markets, and new development cooperation. Then, yung mga nabanggit na yun yung ating tinuturing na drivers or instruments for us to achieve economic globalization. Kasi, technically, economic globalization is concerned with the process of increasing the economy of a certain country and increasing the economic interdependence. As per the next dimension, we have political. So this includes human rights, international terrorism, war, and new security programs na ginagawa per nation. At dahil doon, we were able to expand our connection to our ally countries. Kasi, in doing such, We can enlarge and strengthen our political interrelation across the globe. Next thing is that we have technological. Sa technological, this includes the information technology, which is also one of the instruments when it comes to globalization. Kasi information technology or the new information technology is a product of industrial revolution. Revolution is also an instrument when it comes to globalization. Bakit po? Dahil sa Industrial Revolution, dito nagkaroon tayo ng machinery na magagamit natin up until now, and then it paved the way as well to different innovations. Its aspects, in particular, the internet and multimedia, remarkably contribute to the spread of globalization due to its rapidity, easiness, and availability. So, in spite of its huge benefits, the revolution is still in process and controlled by some advanced nations, which might use it as a means of cultural influence and informational hegemony. So, hindi natin yun may iwasan. When we see cultural dimension naman, this has something to do with the multicultural society of different identities, including the local, political, gender, family, religious, national, individual, and social level. They all play a role para magkaroon ng cultural identity yung isang bansa. At dahil doon, nagkakaroon din ng increase in cultural flows across the globe dahil nag-increase din yung cultural interconnections. Kaya, nagkakaroon tayo ng tinatawag natin na hybridation. Sa hybridation, nagkakaroon ng constructive interaction between global and local characteristics, which is often visible in food, music, dance, film, fashion, and language. Just like what I've said earlier, na ina-adapt ng isang country kung ano yung nakikita niya sa ibang country na maganda, ganun din yung nangyayari when it comes to cultural dimension of globalization. Next, we have religious. Sa religious naman, it is said na ito ay personal or institutionalized set of attitudes, beliefs, and practices relating to or manifesting faithful devotion to an acknowledged ultimate reality or deity. Example ay Christianity. Hindi ba sa Christianity naniniwala na merong isang one supreme being? However, meron tayong iba't ibang sekta na naniniwala kung sino ba yung supreme being yun. Merong Jehovah raw, merong si Iglesia ni Cristo, merong naniniwala din naman na yung God, meron naniniwala si Jesus Christ, and so on. That is the result of religious dimension of globalization. Dahil nga sa existence ng technology, we do have different access or we have wide resources when it comes to information. And through that, we can have different interpretation of the scriptures, which led to the formation of different sects. Dahil nga iba-iba yung paniniwala, iba-iba yung interpretation, so gumagawa tayo ng ating institutionalized set of attitudes, beliefs, and practices. And then, from that, we form or manifest a faithful devotion. Next ay ideological. Si ideological naman, ito yung pagkakaroon natin ng different definitions or different ideologies when it comes to globalization. In ideological dimension, it is filled with a range of norms, claims, beliefs, and narratives about the phenomenon itself. According to Stegner, there are three main types of globalism or ideologies that endow the concept of globalization with particular values and meaning. Specifically, market globalism, justice globalism, and religious globalism. So, si market globalism, it is about the free market norms and neoliberal meanings. Si justice globalism naman, it constructs an alternative vision of globalization based on egalitarian ideals of global solidarity and distributive justice. While religious globalism naman, it is a struggle against both market globalism and justice globalism. Kasi it seeks to mobilize religious values and beliefs that are thought to be under severe attack by the forces of secularism and consumerism na nag-e-exist sa market and justice globalism. And talking about ideological globalism, we have the following core claims of globalism. So we have here globalization is about liberalization and integration of markets. Globalization is inevitable and irreversible. Nobody is in charge of globalization. Globalization benefits everyone in the long run. And then globalization furthers the spread of democracy in the world, as well as globalization requires a global war on terror. Sa una, globalization is about liberalization and global integration of markets. When it comes to globalization, we have the so-called free market. Itong free market na to, it means that we can export and import commodities across the globe. Kaya, we are liberated when it comes to the market and we are able to integrate kung ano man yung product na meron sa bansa natin papunta dun sa ating target market. Sunod, globalization is inevitable and irreversible. Ibig sabihin, once we have stepped up our game when it comes to globalization, there's no turning back. And at the same time, globalization is inevitable. Whether we like it or not, there will be changes brought by globalization. For example, we have now access to different information. We now have access to internet. We now have access to different means of communication as well as transportation. So it will be hard for us to also drop those and go back to what we have or what we don't have nung panahon pa ng hunters and gatherers. At merong mga cases nga na nasa-sacrifice ang ating environment dahil sa globalization. Kaya nagiging controversial ang globalization. However, hindi na natin maibabalik kung ano man yung nawala dahil sa mga factories na nag-exist para lang masabi natin that we are pro-environment or we are saving the environment. What we can do right now is to limit what we are damaging and at the same time, mag-add up tayo dun sa makapag-protect sa environment. Next ay, nobody is in charge of globalization. Yes, meron tayong tinatawag na leaders. Meron tayong tinatawag na government. However, hindi lang sila ang in charge when it comes to globalization. Globalization is a nationwide effort. Therefore, lahat ng tao sa isang bansa should participate in globalization. Next ay globalization benefits everyone in the long run. Merong mga situation kung saan mas yumayaman ang mayayaman at mas sumihirap ang mahihirap dahil sa globalization. For example nga po ay yung pagkakaroon ng industrialization sa isang bansa and then yung goal nila ay mass production. To do such, they will purchase more machines at yung mga machines na to, syempre, mas kokonti na lang yung kinakailangan nilang tao para mag-operate. Therefore, yung mga hindi masyadong skilled worker ay mawawala ng trabaho. At yun nagiging start kung bakit mas sumihirap ang mga mahihirap. Paano po in the long run makikinabang din naman sila dun sa mass production kung ngayon pa lang nawala sila ng trabaho? It will happen once na yung economy naman ay nag-boost. Kasi kapag ka nangyari yun, may possibility na bumaba ang market price ng mga commodities. And sabi nga, eventually, hindi lang naman para sa mayayaman yung mga machineries na yun or hindi lang para sa benefit ng company yung pagkakaroon ng mass production. Kasi an increase in mass production will mean an increase on income when it comes to their company. Tapos magkakaroon din sila ng ambag when it comes to taxes of in the government. At yung taxes na yun, magagamit natin in different infrastructures or in different areas na mapapakinabangan din naman ng lahat. Next is that globalization further furthers the spread of democracy in the world. Hindi nga po ba't meron tayong different sources of information dahil sa globalization. At dahil doon, we are able to express our thoughts and opinions based on the facts that we have gathered. And the more na we are being open to such information, mas nagiging vocal tayo at mas nagiging free tayo when it comes to different matters, whether that is political, cultural, religious, or social. In that sense, nagkakaroon tayo ng more democratic state of mind. Lastly, we have globalization requires a global war on terror. When we say war on terrorism, it is used to describe the American-led global counter-terrorism campaign launched in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. In its scope, expenditure, and impact on international relations, the war on terrorism was comparable to the Cold War. It was intended to represent a new phase in global political relations and has important consequences for security, human rights, international law, cooperation, and governance. The war on terrorism was a multidimensional campaign of almost limitless scope. Take note ng globalization ay multidimensional. Globalization will affect all dimensions kasi ito ay hindi lang nakafocus sa economic perspective, hindi lang nakafocus sa ecological, hindi lang ito nakafocus sa religious dimension. Once na nagkaroon na tayo ng progression in deglobalization, it will affect all dimensions